All right, so get this, a strategic Bitcoin reserve for the U.S. It sounds crazy, right? Like something straight out of a sci-fi movie, but it could actually happen. People have been sending us tons of articles about this, and it seems like with Donald Trump back in the White House, this idea is gaining some serious momentum.
Yeah, it's pretty wild to think about what this could mean for the US dollar, like on a global scale.
Yeah,
We're talking about the government potentially holding almost 5% of all the Bitcoin out there.
I know. It's a lot.
Yeah.
And to really get a handle on just how big this could be, we need to look at the details of what's being proposed. Senator Lummis has this Bitcoin Act, right? And it says that the U.S. Treasury should buy 200,000 Bitcoin every year for 5 years.
Wow.
Yeah, a total of 1 million Bitcoin,
Right.
which is, wait for it, over $76 billion at today's prices.
It's mind-boggling. And the way they're talking about funding this is interesting, too. Instead of just adding to our national debt, the idea is to take existing funds within the Federal Reserve and diversify them, kind of like shifting money from one investment to another within a portfolio.
Okay, so moving money around, but not creating new debt, right?
Mhm.
So they're looking at buying a ton of Bitcoin. But here's the thing. Doesn't the U.S. government already own a bunch of Bitcoin?
Oh, yeah, they do. They've seized billions of dollars worth of Bitcoin from criminal cases.
How much are we talking?
Almost $16 billion worth, according to Arkham Intelligence.
So does that mean that all that sees Bitcoin would automatically become part of this strategic reserve?
That's a good question. It's not totally clear yet. We know that Trump has said in the past that his administration wouldn't sell any seized Bitcoin, which, kind of lines up with this Bitcoin Act and the proposed 20-year minimum holding period. But whether that seized Bitcoin would formally become part of the reserve, that remains to be seen.
So they're talking about buying all this Bitcoin, locking it away for 2 decades, and then we'll see what happens.
Pretty much.
What exactly did Senator Lummis say about what happens after that 20-year mark?
She said that after 20 years, the U.S. would reevaluate its position and make a decision as to where to go from there.
It's interesting, right? 20 years is a long time to hold on to something as volatile as Bitcoin. Makes you wonder what they think might change over that time. But before we get too deep into the potential impacts of all this Bitcoin Act, it's not a done deal yet, right?
No, not at all. It still has to go through the whole legislative process, the Senate, the House, and of course, it needs the president's signature. And while the president-elect has endorsed the act, we're still in the early stages here. Plus, there's debate about whether this reserve would only be made up of Bitcoin the government already owns, or if they'd be buying even more on top of that.
Okay, so we've got this picture of the government potentially sitting on a mountain of Bitcoin. But here's where things get really interesting. Not everyone in the crypto world is happy about this idea. Why are some people so concerned about this?
Well, it comes down to this idea of decentralization. Bitcoin was designed to exist outside the control of any single entity, including government. So giving the U.S. government control over such a huge chunk of Bitcoin, some people see that as going against this whole core principle.
So it's like the government stepping into a space that was specifically designed to be independent.
Exactly. And think about the potential influence they would have on the market if they hold that much Bitcoin, especially after that 20-year holding period. Their decisions to buy or sell could cause huge swings in Bitcoin's price.
It's almost like they would become this massive whale in the Bitcoin ocean. You mentioned market manipulation earlier,
Sure.
and this is where it starts to get a little scary. Didn't one of your sources speak to this?
Yes, Patrick Gerhardt, the president of banking operations at Telcoin. He had this to say: going this route could very well centralize the asset, giving government oversight to an asset that prides itself on being decentralized.
So he's saying this could actually undermine what Bitcoin is supposed to be all about.
That's his concern. And he also said that getting the Bitcoin Act passed could be tough because you have to convince lawmakers who might not fully understand Bitcoin, or its role in the future of finance.
It's like you've got this tension, right? The government may be embracing Bitcoin on one hand, but also potentially controlling it on the other. So what does this mean for the average person? Why should someone who's not a crypto expert even care about this?
That's a great question. And it's something we're going to dig into further. If this strategic reserve does happen, it could have ripple effects throughout the entire financial system, potentially impacting everything from the value of the dollar to the way we invest and manage our own money. But before we get into all that, let's take a closer look at the arguments both for and against the strategic Bitcoin reserve. Because understanding both sides of this debate is crucial to understanding what the consequences could be. Okay, so let's start by looking at why the U.S. government would even consider doing something like this. Something so bold. Proponents argue that a strategic Bitcoin reserve could be this powerful safeguard against global economic uncertainty. Like if you think about diversifying your investment portfolio, but on like a national scale.
Oh, I see. It's kind of like an insurance policy for the U.S. dollar. We all know the dollar is the world's reserve currency, but, that position isn't guaranteed forever.
Exactly. And there are some real concerns out there. Inflation, geopolitical instability, the emergence of new currencies. And Bitcoin, with its limited supply and its decentralized nature, some people see it as a potential safe haven asset.
Okay, so they're thinking, don't put all your eggs in one basket. But instead of gold bars, they're looking at lines of code. Kind of reminds me of how countries used to hoard gold, you know, as a sign of their economic strength.
It's a similar concept, but for the digital age, supporters of this idea believe that holding Bitcoin could protect the U.S. economy from future shocks, potentially even help maintain the dollar's dominance in the global financial system. But this is where we run into the counterarguments, the potential risks of this type of strategy.
You mentioned volatility earlier, and it seems like that's a major concern for a lot of people.
Absolutely. Bitcoin's price has been all over the place in the past, and there's really no guarantee that it will hold its value over the long term. Critics of this idea point out that investing billions of dollars in Bitcoin could seriously backfire if the price were to plummet.
So it's a gamble.
Yeah.
But the people who support this idea, they're arguing that the potential rewards are worth the risk.
Yeah, they believe that Bitcoin has the potential to become a major player in the global financial system, and they don't want the U.S. to be left behind. They see it as a strategic move to secure the dollar's future in a world where finance is rapidly evolving.
Okay, so we've heard from the supporters, we've heard from the skeptics. But how might this actually affect everyday Americans? What would this mean for someone who's maybe heard of Bitcoin but isn't trading it every day?
That's a really important question. And the potential impact on everyday Americans is something that a lot of people are debating. Some argue that it could lead to greater financial stability, protect the value of the dollar, prevent runaway inflation. Essentially, it would act as a kind of buffer against economic shocks.
So a stronger dollar, which in theory benefits everyone. But I imagine there are some downsides to consider as well.
Yeah, definitely. There are concerns about government overreach. Critics worry that this move could give the government too much power over something that's supposed to be decentralized, and that could have unintended consequences for individual freedoms and financial privacy.
So it's a trade-off then.
Yeah.
Potentially more economic stability, but at the cost of less financial freedom.
Exactly. It really raises these questions about the balance between economic security and individual liberties. And finding that balance is going to be a key challenge for policymakers as they try to navigate this really complex issue.
And it's important to remember that this is still just a proposal. It's got a long way to go before it becomes a reality.
Oh, absolutely. There are a lot of hurdles to overcome: legislative approval, public opinion, and of course, the unpredictable nature of the cryptocurrency market itself.
It sounds like this whole debate really highlights that clash between the traditional world of government finance and this disruptive force that is Bitcoin. What are some of the broader implications of this?
One of the biggest implications is that this could spark a global race to accumulate Bitcoin. If the U.S., which is obviously a major economic power, if they establish a strategic Bitcoin reserve, other countries might feel pressured to follow suit. Imagine a world where countries are competing to amass Bitcoin, just like they used to compete for gold.
Wow, a Bitcoin arms race.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty intense thought. What
Yeah.
kind of consequences could that have?
It could drive the price of Bitcoin way up, potentially creating a bubble, but it could also lead to geopolitical tensions. Imagine countries imposing sanctions on each other based on their Bitcoin holdings, or using Bitcoin as leverage in international negotiations. It could really create a whole new dynamic in global power struggles.
It sounds like Bitcoin, even though it was designed to be decentralized, is becoming more and more intertwined with traditional power structures and global politics. This whole conversation reminds me of something I read in one of those articles you sent. Didn't one of the experts talk about the U.S. dollar's future?
Yes, actually, several experts believe that this move could have major implications for the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency. Some argue that holding Bitcoin could actually strengthen the dollar's position. They think it could signal that the U.S. is forward-thinking and adaptable, and that could attract foreign investment and help maintain the dollar's dominance.
So it'd make the dollar more appealing in a world where finance is changing so rapidly.
Yeah, that's the idea. They see it as a way to future-proof the dollar and stay ahead of the curve. But of course, there's the other side of that argument.
Which is?
The idea that holding Bitcoin could actually undermine the dollar's stability. Critics are worried that tying the dollar to an asset as volatile as Bitcoin could expose the U.S. economy to greater risk. If Bitcoin crashes, it could drag the dollar down with it.
Right. It's like putting some of your eggs in a very risky basket.
Yeah.
So it's a gamble with potentially huge consequences either way. What about some of the more practical aspects of creating a reserve like this? Where would they even store all that Bitcoin?
That's a really important question. We have to remember that Bitcoin is a digital asset, which means it's vulnerable to hacking and theft. We've seen those high-profile Bitcoin heists, and a government-held reserve would be a prime target for cybercriminals.
So security would have to be a top priority. What would that even look like?
They would have to implement incredibly strong security measures, probably a combination of cold storage, multi-signature wallets, and other advanced security protocols. Think of it like building a digital Fort Knox designed to be virtually impenetrable.
A digital Fort Knox. That's a powerful image. And beyond the security, there are other logistical challenges as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. Managing a Bitcoin reserve is not easy. The government would need a clear strategy for buying, selling, managing these holdings. They'd have to decide when to buy, when to sell, how to rebalance the portfolio over time.
So it wouldn't be a set it and forget it kind of investment.
Definitely not. It would require active management and strategic decision making. And remember, all of these decisions would be under intense public scrutiny. Transparency would be crucial to maintain public trust.
Okay, so setting up this reserve would be a massive undertaking. But let's zoom out for a second. What does this whole debate tell us about the government's evolving attitude towards Bitcoin?
That's a fascinating question. For a long time, governments have been wary of Bitcoin, concerned about the lack of regulation, the potential for illegal activities, and the challenge it poses to their control over monetary policy. But now it seems like things are starting to shift. Some governments are recognizing the potential benefits of Bitcoin, whether it's as an investment, a hedge against inflation, or even a tool for geopolitical influence.
So are we witnessing a turning point? Are governments finally warming up to Bitcoin?
It's definitely possible. There's this growing recognition that Bitcoin is here to stay, and governments are starting to figure out how to integrate it into their existing financial systems. But this raises another set of challenges. Regulation. How do you regulate something like Bitcoin? It's decentralized. Traditional regulatory frameworks were designed for centralized institutions like banks. Bitcoin operates outside of those structures. It's a real dilemma for governments. How do you regulate without stifling innovation or undermining the whole decentralized nature of Bitcoin?
So they're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
And the outcome of all this regulatory experimentation, it's going to have a huge impact on Bitcoin's future. It's going to determine whether Bitcoin becomes a truly global currency or remains a niche asset.
It sounds like the stakes are pretty high. Speaking of stakes, what would all of this mean for the cryptocurrency market itself? How might a government's decision to hold Bitcoin affect its price, and how widely it's adopted?
That's a great question. Some people believe that it could actually have a positive impact, lend legitimacy to Bitcoin, boost its credibility. If a major government like the U.S. says, hey, we endorse Bitcoin, we're going to hold it as a reserve asset, that could send a signal to investors and businesses that Bitcoin is a safe and valuable asset, and that could encourage more people to invest, drive up the price, increase adoption.
So it's like a seal of approval from a trusted authority.
Exactly. But other people worry that government involvement could actually have a negative impact. They fear that it could lead to greater centralization and control, which goes against the whole idea of Bitcoin. If governments start accumulating huge amounts of Bitcoin, they could manipulate the market for their own benefit.
Right, that seems to contradict this whole idea of Bitcoin being decentralized and free from government control.
Oh.
So it's like a double-edged sword then. Government involvement could boost Bitcoin's legitimacy, but it could also threaten its independence and its core principles.
Precisely. And it's a dilemma that the entire cryptocurrency community is grappling with as governments around the world are starting to take notice of Bitcoin. And the outcome of this struggle is going to have a huge impact on the future of Bitcoin and the whole cryptocurrency ecosystem.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential economic and market impacts. But what about any ethical implications we need to consider?
That's an important part of this debate that often gets overlooked. One ethical concern is inequality. Bitcoin is often seen as a tool for financial inclusion, allowing people who don't have access to banks to access financial services. But if governments start accumulating lots of Bitcoin, it could drive up the price, which could make it even harder for ordinary people to afford it.
So instead of bridging the wealth gap, it could make it worse.
Exactly. It could create this new class of Bitcoin haves and have-nots. Another ethical concern is the environmental impact of Bitcoin mining. If governments encourage more people to adopt Bitcoin, it could lead to a surge in mining activity, which could put even more strain on the environment. Governments need to carefully weigh the potential economic benefits against the environmental costs.
That's definitely a crucial consideration, especially with climate change becoming such an urgent issue.
Yeah.
Are there any other ethical concerns related to government involvement in Bitcoin?
Yes. The potential for government overreach. If governments start holding Bitcoin, they might be tempted to use their power to control how it's used and developed. Maybe impose restrictions on how it's used, censor transactions, even confiscate Bitcoin holdings. This raises some serious concerns about individual freedoms and privacy.
It sounds like governments need to be very careful and make sure that their actions are transparent and accountable. With all of these potential implications in mind, what do you think the future holds for Bitcoin? Will it revolutionize finance? Or will it just fade away as a passing fad?
Well, it's impossible to predict the future, for sure. But we can look at the trends and make some educated guesses. One thing's for sure, Bitcoin has already disrupted the financial industry. It's introduced new technologies, new business models, new ways of thinking about money. It's challenged the traditional power structures of finance and empowered people to take control of their own finances.
So it's already shaken things up.
Okay.
But will it ultimately succeed in its mission to create a more decentralized financial system?
That remains to be seen. There are definitely challenges ahead. Regulatory uncertainty, technological hurdles, competition from other cryptocurrencies. But there's also this growing sense of momentum. Bitcoin adoption is increasing. Institutional investors are starting to get involved. Governments are trying to figure out how to integrate it into their systems.
So the future is uncertain but full of potential. It seems like Bitcoin emerged at a really pivotal moment in history.
Absolutely. It appeared in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, at a time when trust in traditional institutions was completely shattered. People were looking for alternatives. And Bitcoin offered this vision of a decentralized financial system free from the control of governments and banks.
So it wasn't just about the technology, it was a response to a crisis of trust.
Exactly. It appealed to people who were disillusioned with the status quo, people who believed that technology could empower individuals and create a more just society. Bitcoin is more than just a cryptocurrency. It's a social and cultural phenomenon. It reflects how our relationship with money, technology, and power is evolving.
And its impact is already being felt all over the world,
Yeah.
especially in developing countries.
Oh, absolutely. In a lot of developing countries where financial institutions are weak and people have limited access to banking, Bitcoin is giving people a way to access financial services, send money, participate in the global economy. It has the potential to empower individuals, boost economic growth, promote financial inclusion.
It sounds like a game changer.
Right.
But I'm sure there are still some challenges to overcome in those contexts.
Of course, Bitcoin's volatility can be a barrier, and a lack of infrastructure in some regions makes it difficult for people to access it. But even with those hurdles, Bitcoin is making a difference. It's being used for remittances, payments, even microloans. And as more and more people adopt it, its impact on developing countries is likely to increase.
It's amazing to think how a technology like this could potentially transform lives and economies.
Yeah.
But what does this all mean for institutions like central banks? They've always been the gatekeepers of the financial system. How are they responding to this challenge to their authority?
That's a great question. And it's one that a lot of people are asking central banks. They control the money supply, set interest rates, regulate financial institutions. Bitcoin, with its decentralized nature, directly challenges their control.
So how are they adapting?
Some central banks are experimenting with their own digital currencies, or what they call central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. These are like digital versions of existing fiat currencies, issued and controlled by central banks. They offer some of the benefits of Bitcoin, like faster transactions, but they still give central banks control over the money supply.
It seems like the future of money is going to be this fascinating mix of traditional currencies, cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, and these new CBDCs. But it's not just finance that's being impacted. We're seeing Bitcoin making its way into some pretty unexpected areas like the art world. How did that happen?
It might seem strange at first, but Bitcoin and art actually have some things in common. They both represent forms of value, created and exchanged outside of traditional systems. Bitcoin exists independently of governments and banks, and art is often valued for its aesthetic qualities and its scarcity.
So they both challenge the established ways of doing things.
Exactly. And we're seeing artists using Bitcoin to create and sell their work. Collectors buying art with Bitcoin. Even auction houses accepting Bitcoin as payment. It's adding this whole new dimension to the art market. creating new opportunities for artists and collectors, challenging the traditional art world.
It's incredible how Bitcoin is finding its way into all these different areas of our lives.
Yeah.
You know, when I was preparing for this deep dive, I was reading about how it's even starting to disrupt the music industry.
It's true. The music industry, which is dominated by these huge record labels and streaming platforms, is ready for some disruption. And Bitcoin offers artists a way to bypass those middlemen and connect directly with their fans.
So cutting out the middleman and giving artists more control.
Exactly. We're already seeing artists using Bitcoin to release their music,
Yeah.
sell merchandise, get donations from fans. It's giving them more control over their careers, creating new revenue streams. It's a win-win for both the artists and the fans.
It's amazing how this technology is opening up so many new possibilities,
Yeah.
and it doesn't stop there. What about the gaming industry?
The gaming industry is all over Bitcoin. A lot of online games are now using Bitcoin as in-game currency. Players can earn Bitcoin by playing games, use it to buy in-game items, and even cash out their earnings for real-world money.
It's like blurring the lines between the virtual world and the real world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's adding a whole new level of excitement and engagement to gaming, and this trend is only going to get bigger.
With all this talk about the potential benefits and exciting possibilities, it's easy to get caught up in the hype. But we need to remember that Bitcoin, like any new technology, comes with risks.
You're absolutely right. It's important to be aware of the potential downsides. One of the biggest risks is volatility. Bitcoin's price has been all over the map, and there's no guarantee that it won't continue to fluctuate wildly.
So it's not for the risk averse.
No, it's not. If you're investing in Bitcoin, be prepared to lose money. Another risk is security. Because it's a digital asset, Bitcoin is vulnerable to hacking and theft. There have been a lot of those high-profile Bitcoin heists, so you need to take steps to secure your holdings. Use a reputable wallet. Enable two-factor authentication. Be careful about where you store your Bitcoin.
Security is definitely crucial in the world of crypto. What about the regulations surrounding Bitcoin? It seems like they're constantly changing.
Yeah. The regulatory landscape for Bitcoin is still evolving, and it's different in every country. So you have to stay informed about the regulations where you live and make sure you're complying with all the laws.
So do your research and stay up to date.
Exactly. And finally, we have to remember that Bitcoin is still a relatively new technology. There are a lot of unknowns about whether it will be viable in the long term.
So a healthy dose of skepticism is probably a good thing.
Absolutely. Don't invest more than you can afford to lose. And be prepared for the possibility that Bitcoin could fail.
It sounds like a balanced approach is really important when you're dealing with Bitcoin. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, where does this leave us? What can we say about how Bitcoin might impact the future?
Bitcoin definitely has the potential to change the world in some really profound ways. It's already disrupting industries, empowering individuals, creating new opportunities. But it's crucial to be aware of the risks. Approach it with a balanced perspective, and recognize that its future is still uncertain, even though it's full of possibilities.
It's been really amazing to explore all these different aspects of Bitcoin. And before we wrap up, I want to come back to this idea of a strategic Bitcoin reserve.
Right.
It seems like it represents all of the tensions and possibilities we've been talking about.
You're right. It's this clash between the old and the new, centralized and decentralized risk and opportunity. It's a decision that could completely reshape the financial landscape, and the implications are huge.
So what's the final verdict? Should the U.S. create a strategic Bitcoin reserve?
Ultimately, that's a question each individual has to answer for themselves. We've looked at the arguments for and against, the potential economic and geopolitical consequences, and the ethical considerations. Ultimately, the decision is going to come down to a judgment call about what's best for the U.S. economy and its future. And it's a decision that will shape the financial world for years to come.
And it's a debate that will continue to follow closely as it unfolds. But for now, we've reached the end of part 2 of our Bitcoin deep dive. In our final part, we're going to bring all of these threads together and leave you with some thought-provoking questions to ponder. So we spent all this time talking about a potential strategic Bitcoin reserve for the U.S., the benefits, the risks, the political arguments, and the impact it could have on the world. It's complicated stuff. And honestly, the more we talk about it, the more questions come up.
I think that's what's so fascinating about this whole conversation. It really shows that tension between traditional financial systems and something as disruptive as Bitcoin. It's like watching these two massive forces collide, and we're standing right in the middle.
And the result of that collision could be huge, not just for the U.S., but for the entire global financial system, like a chain reaction waiting to happen.
Imagine this. The U.S. decides to go for it, creates the strategic Bitcoin reserve. What message does that send to other countries? We could see a global rush to buy up Bitcoin central banks all over the world scrambling to get their hands on it, just like they did with gold.
A Bitcoin arms race. Countries battling it out for digital dominance. That's a pretty wild thought. But it's not just about the economic implications. We have to think about the social and political ones, too.
Absolutely. This move could give governments more control over a decentralized asset than ever before, which could erode the very principles that drew people to Bitcoin in the first place. It raises the question, would it actually undermine the freedom and individual sovereignty that Bitcoin is supposed to represent?
That's a big question, and one we can't answer right now. There's no way to know for sure how this will all play out. But one thing's for certain. The world of finance is changing fast, and Bitcoin is a major driving force behind that change.
So what does all this mean for you?
First, stay informed. Things move quickly in the Bitcoin world, so it's important to keep up with what's happening. Read articles, listen to podcasts like this one, have conversations. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to Bitcoin.
And don't just take in information passively. Think critically. Question everything. Don't believe everything you hear. Weigh the evidence. Look at different perspectives. Come to your own conclusions. There's a lot of hype and misinformation out there, so it's important to be able to separate fact from fiction.
Like we've been saying, the financial landscape is changing, and Bitcoin is at the forefront of that change. Whether you're a seasoned investor or just starting to learn about this world, the choices you make today could have a big impact on your financial future.
So stay informed, be critical, and most importantly, be prepared. The future of finance is unfolding right now, and it's going to be fascinating, maybe even a little bumpy.
And with that, we've come to the end of our deep dive into the world of a potential U.S. strategic Bitcoin reserve. We hope you found this exploration as thought-provoking as we did. The world is full of fascinating questions, and we'll be back next week to tackle another one. Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and stay curious.